Welcome back to the Talking Ketamine podcast. This is episode 70, Extinguishing the Fire, At-Home Ketamine for Burnout.
Today we're looking at a fascinating new real-world study tracking nearly 400 adults dealing with occupational burnout who tried at-home ketamine-assisted therapy. The results are eye-opening. Over 76% of those with severe burnout saw their symptoms remit after 6 sessions. It raises a huge question. Could ketamine be the reset button that exhausted professionals have been searching for?
So if you have ever, hit a wall at work and had well-meaning HR reps tell you to just take a bubble bath or maybe try some mindfulness exercises, you know exactly how profoundly insulting that feels.
Yeah, it's completely dismissive of the actual problem.
Right. It's like trying to put out a forest fire with a water gun. But today we're unpacking a radically different, much more intensive approach. We're looking at a brand new retrospective analysis of 395 adults who actually completed a highly structured at-home ketamine protocol.
And this was through a telehealth platform called Mindbloom.
Exactly. And the whole goal here is to figure out if this treatment is a genuine, science-backed way to reverse that chronic, absolute systemic drain of workplace burnout when standard self-care just utterly fails you.
Well, before we get into how a ketamine intervention actually affects the brain here, it's really critical to define the parameters of what we're attempting to reset.
Because people use the word burnout for everything now.
Oh, constantly. The term has suffered from massive semantic dilution. It gets thrown around in casual conversation to describe, like, having a frustrating week at the office.
Or just feeling sluggish after a long meeting.
Right. But clinically speaking, the medical community views it through a much more severe lens. The World Health Organization actually officially recognizes burnout in the ICD-11, which is their international classification of diseases.
Wow, so it's a recognized disease classification.
Yes, specifically as a chronic occupational phenomenon. It's not conceptualized as a temporary mood, but as a syndrome resulting from chronic workplace stress that hasn't been successfully managed.
That WHO classification is so vital because it really takes the blame off the individual. It recognizes this as a systemic occupational hazard rather than, personal failing or some lack of mental resilience.
Exactly. It's an external stressor breaking you down.
And when you look at the lived experience of true clinical burnout, it's this heavy, crushing weight. It feels like walking around with a completely empty battery.
That's a perfect way to describe it.
Yeah, your emotional reserves are so profoundly depleted that simply pulling into the office parking lot makes you want to put your head on the steering wheel and weep. And then, to protect yourself from that agonizing stress, your brain builds a massive defensive firewall.
Which is where the emotional detachment comes in.
Right, you become incredibly cynical. You start viewing your colleagues, your clients, and your daily tasks as active threats to your survival, rather than just parts of your career.
And the study we're looking at today measures that exact phenomenon using the gold standard diagnostic tool, which is the Maslach Burnout Inventory, specifically the general survey version.
Okay, and how exactly does that measure the burnout?
It evaluates the condition across 3 highly distinct dimensions. You actually just illustrated the first 2 perfectly.
Oh, the empty battery and the firewall.
Right. The first dimension is exhaustion, so that absolute depletion of resources. The second dimension is cynicism, that defensive firewall of negative, callous responses to the job. But there is a third, equally insidious dimension, which is reduced professional efficacy.
Reduced professional efficacy, meaning like a fundamental breakdown in your belief that you're even competent at your job anymore.
That is the core of it. I mean, if exhaustion is the empty battery and cynicism is the firewall, then low professional efficacy is the sensation of spinning your wheels in thick mud.
Oh man, spinning wheels in mud, that is visceral.
Yeah, you might be putting in 60-hour weeks, exerting maximum effort, but you feel like you were getting absolutely nowhere. There's zero sense of accomplishment. Tasks that used to take you 20 minutes now take 3 hours, and the final product just feels entirely inadequate.
You're exhausted, you resent everything around you, and even when you summon the strength to try, you just feel entirely useless.
Exactly. It's a total breakdown.
When you understand burnout as a complete systemic shutdown across those 3 dimensions, it makes total sense that a long weekend isn't going to fix it. The biology of the brain has fundamentally adapted to chronic stress.
Which leads us directly to the intervention tested in this new study.
Right, at-home ketamine-assisted therapy. The researchers wanted to see if ketamine could actually move the needle on these 3 specific dimensions, since it has well-documented antidepressant properties.
And a demonstrated ability to promote resilience in chronic stress models. The rationale stems from how chronic stress physically alters the brain. Prolonged exposure to cortisol actually causes dendritic retraction.
Meaning the neural connections literally shrink?
Yes, they shrink and wither in areas responsible for emotional regulation. Ketamine, biologically, prompts a massive surge of glutamate, triggering synaptogenesis, which essentially forces the brain to rapidly grow new connections and repair those withered pathways.
Okay, so the biological mechanism makes sense, but I have to pause here. We really need to look at the actual delivery method because this is where a lot of people are going to be deeply skeptical.
I imagine so, yes.
When we hear the phrase at-home ketamine, the immediate mental image is highly concerning. Wait, so a deeply overwhelmed, severely burned out professional just gets a potent dissociative anesthetic mailed to their house?
I know it sounds incredibly risky when you phrase it like that.
It really does. What are the actual clinical guardrails preventing this from being just a dangerous free-for-all?
Well, the distinction between clinical telehealth and recreational use is the crux of this entire protocol. This study analyzed a highly structured telehealth-guided program.
So they aren't just taking it alone with no oversight.
Not at all. It's a retrospective analysis, meaning researchers look back at real-world data of 395 adults who had already completed this specific 6-session protocol. The medication is highly regulated.
How do they actually take it?
Patients self-administer via sublingual lozenges that dissolve under the tongue or through subcutaneous injections, but they do not choose their own doses.
Right, so a doctor is still prescribing a specific amount.
Exactly. The dosing is locked within a standardized therapeutic range determined by a licensed psychiatric clinician based on the patient's medical history.
But even with a prescribed dose, just taking a medication alone while sitting on your couch doesn't typically resolve complex occupational trauma. There has to be some sort of psychological framework holding this together.
Oh, the psychological framework is the heaviest lifter here. The protocol includes mandatory remote clinical supervision.
What does that look like in practice?
Well, before a patient ever takes the medication, there is a structured preparation phase. A clinician helps them set clear intentions and establish a safe physical and mental space.
That makes a lot of sense.
And during the actual session, patients have remote clinician availability if they encounter distress. But most importantly, there are structured integration practices afterward.
Integration, meaning like talking through the experience.
Yes. The patient works with a guide to process the insights gained during that neuroplastic window ketamine opens. They figure out how to apply those new perspectives to their daily boundaries and work habits.
So it's a comprehensive therapy model delivered via secure telehealth. That context is crucial for anyone listening. Yeah. We are talking about a tightly controlled clinical protocol, not some unsupervised mail order service.
Exactly.
So with the safety and structural parameters clear, let's look at the actual data, because a 76% remission rate sounds like a miracle cure, and we know there are no miracles without a catch.
True, but the primary findings are genuinely staggering for a treatment-resistant population. The researchers isolated the patients who entered the program with the most severe classification possible on the Maslach scale.
The profile they call full burnout.
Right. To hit this classification, a patient must meet the critical threshold on all 3 dimensions simultaneously.
High exhaustion, high cynicism, and low professional efficacy.
Yes. And among the patients who completed the program, 76.1% achieved total remission of that full burnout classification by the end of their 6 sessions.
76%. That is practically unheard of for a condition that routinely ends careers.
It's a massive shift in baseline symptoms.
For someone listening who feels permanently broken by their job, who assumes their only option is to quit their industry entirely, that is not just a statistic. That is a lifeline.
It offers a very tangible path back to baseline. And researchers also track the opposite end of the spectrum, looking at how many participants moved into the profile classified as engaged.
Which is basically the operational antithesis of being burned out, right?
Exactly. Being engaged requires a patient to report high energy, deep involvement in their work, and a strong feeling of effectiveness.
And how did those numbers look?
Over the course of the 6 sessions, the proportion of participants classified as engaged nearly tripled, jumping from 16.7% at baseline to 49.4%.
Wow. Tripling the engagement rate takes a workforce from barely surviving to actively participating in their careers again.
It's a substantial shift.
But this brings up a vital question about the mechanics of recovery. We outlined those 3 distinct dimensions: the empty battery, the defensive firewall, and the spinning wheels. Did the ketamine reset all 3 of those uniformly?
It actually didn't. The subscale data reveals a very distinct staged recovery process. The three dimensions do not respond at the same time or at the same magnitude.
Oh, really? Which ones responded first?
The intervention was overwhelmingly most effective and most rapid at relieving the first two dimensions. Over 55% of the completers saw significant improvement in their exhaustion scores.
And the cynicism.
Almost 49% saw a similar improvement there. What's truly fascinating from a neurobiological perspective is that this change was heavily front-loaded.
Front-loaded meaning they felt better right away.
Yes, by just the second session out of 6, patients had already achieved nearly half of their total overall improvement on those two specific scales.
That rapid timeline makes sense when we think about what ketamine does to the brain's default networks. The relief from that bone-deep exhaustion and bitter detachment happens quickly because the medication physically interrupts the rumination loops.
Exactly. It rapidly silences those blaring internal alarms of the acute stress response,
Allowing the battery to charge and the firewall to drop. But what about the third dimension? The professional efficacy.
Rebuilding that intrinsic feeling of competence took considerably more time and showed a much smaller response rate. Only about 26% of the completers saw a significant improvement in efficacy.
That is a sharp drop-off compared to the other two.
It is, and their progress on this specific metric essentially plateaued by session 4.
Only 26%. But clinically, that makes intuitive sense. I mean, if you've been drowning in burnout and producing subpar work for a year, simply feeling less exhausted on a Tuesday doesn't instantly make you feel like a master of your craft again.
No, it certainly doesn't.
Rebuilding a person's intrinsic trust in their own capabilities requires actual lived experiences of success. You have to get back in the seat, execute a project, and prove your competence to yourself in real time. A medication cannot magically implant the memory of a job well done.
The item-level data within the survey perfectly supports your assessment. Within the professional efficacy scale itself, the specific questions that showed the most improvement were related to the affective and motivational sides of work.
Like feeling excited about a project.
Right. Statements like, I feel exhilarated when I accomplish something, or I feel I'm making an effective contribution. Those improved. But the questions capturing generalized, hard capability statements like, I'm good at my job, those barely moved.
So the biological intervention rapidly returns your energy and your openness to feeling rewarded, but it can't instantly rewrite the long-term cognitive appraisal of your skills.
Exactly. That requires environmental feedback and time.
So the battery recharges and the firewall drops long before the wheels find traction in the mud again.
That's a great summary.
Looking at this holistically, we have a highly structured therapy that dramatically reduces the most painful symptoms of burnout. But we need to look at the shadows in the data. What is the clinical catch here?
Well, the safety data is actually the bright spot among the limitations. The safety profile in this real-world cohort was excellent. Side effects of any type were reported at remarkably low rates.
How low are we talking?
Fluctuating between 3.5% and 4.3% across the different time points. Furthermore, there were 0 serious side effects reported during this cohort window.
That's incredible. So what is the catch, scientifically speaking?
It lies in the massive empirical overlap between occupational burnout and major depressive disorder.
Oh, right. This is a huge academic debate, isn't it? Disentangling whether someone is suffering from severe burnout caused by their job or if they have clinical depression that is simply manifesting heavily during their working hours.
It is one of the most contested areas in occupational psychology. Researchers have argued for years that severe burnout overlaps so problematically with depression that we should reframe these presentations as occupational depression.
And others argue they're related but distinct entities. Like burnout is domain-specific to your job, whereas depression is pervasive across your entire life.
Exactly. The complication for this specific study is that clinical depression was the primary medical indication for treatment for the vast majority of these patients. It co-occurred heavily with their burnout symptoms.
Wait, so if the vast majority of these patients were primarily being treated for depression and there was no placebo control group in this study, we have a massive causation problem.
We do.
How do we know the ketamine actually fixed the occupational burnout directly? Isn't it highly probable that the ketamine simply lifted a heavy, suffocating blanket of generalized depression, which consequently made their jobs feel tolerable again?
That is the exact limitation the authors acknowledge. It's the classic correlation versus causation dilemma, deeply complicated by comorbid conditions.
Because depression and burnout share so many symptoms, right?
A massive amount of symptomatic real estate. Profound exhaustion, anhedonia, lack of motivation, cognitive fog. When the ketamine rapidly repairs the neural pathways, alleviating the underlying depression, the scores on the burnout inventory will naturally improve as a secondary effect.
Right, because you just feel better overall.
Exactly. And because this is an observational study design without an active or sham control arm, it is scientifically impossible to cleanly isolate ketamine's specific direct mechanism of action on occupational burnout, independent of those generalized mood improvements.
Which is exactly why the scientific community constantly demands randomized controlled trials. To truly know if this is a burnout treatment and not just a depression treatment, you would need two identical groups of burned out professionals who do not have depression,
Yeah.
giving one the ketamine and one a placebo.
Precisely.
But beyond the depression overlap, there is another glaring red flag in this data regarding the sample size. You mentioned earlier that this was a completer cohort of 395 adults.
I did, yes.
But the study started with 1,642 people who met the baseline criteria. That means 395 adults represents only 24% of the initial group. What happened to the other 76% of the participants?
They did not complete all 4 of the scheduled burnout assessments required by the study design, so their data was excluded from the specific analysis.
That introduces a massive potential for selection bias.
You're right to flag this. It definitely does.
I mean, that completely skews the reality of the intervention. If a restaurant brags that 76% of its patrons gave them a 5-star review, but they actively exclude the 76% of customers who walked out before the main course was served, that is incredibly misleading.
It definitely tempers our expectations significantly. The people who drop out of clinical surveys often do so for systematic reasons.
Right, like they might be the individuals for whom the treatment was completely ineffective.
Exactly. Or whose exhaustion was so profound they couldn't muster the energy to complete a basic questionnaire. Conversely, some might have dropped out because they felt better immediately and didn't see the need to keep checking in.
We simply don't know.
We don't. The impressive response rates we've discussed apply specifically and exclusively to individuals who successfully complete the entire protocol and follow-up structure. We cannot mathematically generalize these remission rates to every single person who initiates the therapy.
We also have to factor in the statistical quirk of extreme baseline scoring. To even be included in this cohort, every single patient had to meet a moderate or higher burnout threshold from day one.
Yes, the phenomenon known as regression to the mean. When you require a sample population to exhibit extremely high symptom scores to enter a study, basic statistical probability dictates that their scores will naturally drift downward or improve over time.
Simply by chance.
Yes, completely independent of any medical intervention.
It's like deciding to start a new diet on the day you ate the worst meals of your entire life. Just by the sheer laws of average human behavior, you are going to eat slightly better the following day, whether the new diet is scientifically sound or not.
That's a perfect analogy.
So, synthesizing all of this, we are looking at a highly structured, heavily guarded, at-home telehealth therapy that appears safe and dramatically reduces the immediate alarms of exhaustion and cynicism for those who can complete the program.
That's correct.
However, we absolutely need more rigorous, randomized controlled trials to understand exactly how much of this is treating burnout directly versus treating underlying depression.
That is a highly accurate assessment of the landscape. This is what we call a powerful hypothesis-generating study. It doesn't provide the final, definitive answer, but it loudly signals that there is a profound biological effect occurring here that warrants intense, rigorous investigation.
As we wrap up this analysis, I want to leave everyone listening with a final, provocative thought to mull over, specifically regarding how we manage workplace recovery.
What are you thinking?
Well, we saw a very clear chronological staging in the data. The affective and motivational dimensions of work, regaining your physical energy, feeling open to your colleagues again, losing that protective cynicism, those return far quicker than your feelings of actual hard professional capability.
Right. The wheels take significantly longer to find traction than it does for the battery to charge.
Exactly. So if that biological timeline is true, perhaps corporate America needs to completely rethink how it reintegrates employees who are returning from burnout or medical leave.
That's an interesting point.
Instead of immediately throwing them back into the deep end, demanding high-level performance and complex problem-solving the second they log back in, the initial focus needs to be strictly on sustaining their fragile, returned energy.
Ease them back into the workflow.
Right. Managers need to provide them with small, immediate wins that make them feel exhilarated and useful, rather than overwhelming them with tasks that demand generalized competence until that vital professional efficacy truly has the time and the environmental evidence to rebuild.
That would fundamentally change how we handle occupational recovery.
It is incredibly validating to see science confirm that the crushing weight of burnout can actually lift, offering real hope to anyone who feels like their battery has been completely drained.
Indeed, while we need controlled trials to fully isolate ketamine's direct impact from general mood changes, these real-world outcomes show that guided at-home therapy is a safe, highly promising option for clinical burnout.
A truly promising path forward. Thanks for listening to the Talking Ketamine podcast. We'll catch you on the next one.